Welcome to Energy Vista, a podcast on energy issues where we make experts great again and contribute actively to the public debate and policy making around commodities, the geopolitics of energy, and trade. I'm your host, Leslie Palti-Guzman. It's June 3rd, 2026, and time for a new Energy Vista episode. Today, my guest is Brenda Shaffer. Brenda is an international energy and foreign policy specialist focusing on international energy policies, natural gas trade, and foreign policy, Caspian energy, Iranian energy exports, energy security policy, European energy security, critical energy infrastructure protection, and East Med energy, among many other topics. She is a faculty member at the Energy Academy Group of the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School, and she is also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council for Global Energy Center in Washington, D.C. Hi, Brenda. I'm very delighted to have you as a guest on the Energy Vista podcast.
Thank you so much.
So, a major question right now for experts, analysts like us, is how policymakers and governments are going to interpret the current Iran energy crisis and with all the disruptions that we've seen around the Strait of Hormuz and how it's impacted the flow of fossil fuels, notably. So, how those governments and companies are going to move forward, and do you think they are going to take the right lessons from this crisis? Or are we going to make some mistakes that we have already done in the past? And you've been reading recently a provocative Wall Street op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, arguing that renewable energy gives us a crisis and that Western climate policies have weakened energy security and may have given a leverage to Iran. So explain us where you come from on this.
Right. So you ask if we're going to learn lessons and the right lessons from this current global oil and LNG crisis. And I could look to an energy crisis that emerged in February 2022. And following Russia's second invasion of Ukraine. And I could already see that then we learned the wrong lessons, we discussed the wrong lessons, and even in any possible lessons that could have been learned were not implemented. So no, I doubt. First thing, I think we tend to overemphasize geopolitical events, meaning that the assumption needs to be in all of our, whether it's companies or governments or international institutions that are interested in energy security, the assumption needs to be that there's always going to be some kind of disruptions. They could be geological, they could be extreme weather, they could be geopolitical, they could be economic, right? So let's say we had something like COVID economic shutdown, so suddenly you have a huge drop in demand for energy. These kind of disruptions, they're not black swans, they're not unexpected. They're actually part of what we do in energy security. But unfortunately, because of a variety of different political interests, instead of saying, "Hey, yes, why we're having a crisis, for instance, in winter 2022, is because we didn't prepare our market for disruptions." Instead, it's easier to say, "Oh, this was Putin's gas war," or "This is a oil price excel because of Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the Western sanctions," right? But the reality is that we have these energy crises because we don't prepare our markets for disruptions. So again, disruptions are what we should, of course, anticipate. And the failure is a lack of preparation of global energy markets. But no, I don't think we'll draw the right conclusions because there's so many political interests. Most of the international system, it's easier to blame it on Trump and Israel than to look at their own policies. And the same thing that saying that the especially European energy crisis in 2022. We had one already in 2020, 2021, simply because Europeans did not invest enough in their natural gas, in preparing their markets. And, they already had price spikes in those two winters. The third one after the Ukraine invasion, was just a continuation of a pattern. So,
Yeah, so talking about Europe, actually, even France recently decided to set up a new electrification task force. And we've seen comments from different governments emphasizing the idea of accelerating electrification, whether it's going to be in Europe and in Asia. Do you think it's a good idea? And do you think that rejecting, like putting the blame on fossil fuels, basically, is not the right conclusion?
no, yeah, of course. I mean, because it's easy. People that anyways want to promote an agenda of renewable energy, they say, here's a problem here with fossil fuels, and they try to say that this is a justification why we need to go over to renewable energy. So I would say a couple things on that. One, if you think it's rough having Hormuz or having Putin, try being 100% dependent on Chinese supply lines. I think that would be a much bigger geopolitical threat. Two, today's renewables operate on a base load of primarily fossil fuels. So
This is like a key point, I think, because many people, when we say electrification, they don't wonder where the electricity comes from, which energy source.
right, they often think that somehow electricity itself is an energy source, right? But today's renewables, mainly wind, solar, hydropower, they need a baseload fuel. They need, of course, this, but for our audience, they need a constant source of energy to keep an electricity system running. So basically, when you use renewable energy, it's not that you replace fossil fuels. You run it, in a sense in parallel or in tandem with fossil fuels, mainly in the West, natural gas. So it doesn't really additional renewable energy by today's technologies doesn't replace fossil fuels, especially natural gas. It works with them. And third, we don't really have. You could throw all the money in the world at wind and solar, all your policy time. You still cannot support modern economies by wind and solar. So it's basically misleading the public when you say we're in an energy transition. Where somehow we're using less fossil fuels. I don't know how much people in our audience knows, but today the fossil fuels provide 87% of global energy, and
Of the primary energy mix, right?
and
Primary energy
the
source.
global primary consumption. And in the 1970s, after the 1973 energy crisis, 73, 74, when we started the sort of public promotion of renewable energy, subsidies, policy promotion, we were about 84%. So with all these trillions of dollars invested in renewable energy, we're using less renewable energy today than we used when we started this policy journey.
Very interesting. I think it's key. I think the belief that renewable could replace all fossil fuels was misleading, and also this idea that emerging economies could leapfrog directly from fossil fuel to a clean energy transition, decarbonized energy, like energy mix, right?
Right. No, I think this idea of leapfrog, I mean, it's actually quite cruel to the nations and the peoples that you've been asking to make this leap. Because no, it's never happened. I mean, first thing, the assumption is that somehow renewable energy is progress compared to fossil fuels. That if you ask most people in Africa, the fact that global institutions like the G7, World Bank, EU have stopped public finance for fossil fuels. This has not helped them get more access to electricity. This has actually been, we've had the first backwalking in electricity access in Africa in decades. And we have sort of a system, I think it's even quite cruel, because now the World Bank, International Energy Agency, they count electricity access as even partial electricity access. So some guy gets a solar lantern, solar power, that can power maybe a lantern, his phone, but that doesn't give him clean cooking. This doesn't power a tractor. This doesn't produce fertilizer. So sort of the main benefits of electricity access, this partial electricity access, doesn't give to people. So yeah, I think it's quite cruel how we have sort of a different standards. That sort of partial electricity access in Africa is now somehow considered electricity access.
So because of these policies in international financing for energy project and infrastructure, do you think there were opportunities lost, like in Africa, in terms of major infrastructure project, export or import projects?
For sure, and it even connects, Leslie, to your first question about the current crisis in Hormuz. So, for decades, and you've worked on gas projects in so many different parts of the world, as part of your background. For decades, a big emphasis in the institutions and the countries that were thinking about energy security was diversification, right? So we shouldn't concentrate everything in the Middle East. We shouldn't concentrate everything in Russia, and for a variety of reasons. But we're seeing right now, the danger of let's say so much dependence on a certain geographic location, like behind the Straits of Hormuz. And so for years, projects like Caspian Energy, Eastern Mediterranean Energy in Africa, they were invested in from a commercial point of view, but they also had policy support and public finance in order to diversify our global energy supplies. Well, fast forward to about 2018, 2019, and suddenly this thing, actually a third topic we've just mentioned, this idea that we're in this energy transition and we don't need fossil fuels anymore. And you have the International Energy Agency saying in 2021 there should be no more investments in fossil fuels. Suddenly, most international governments, for sure the United States, for sure the EU, stopped thinking about diversification. And Africa really got hurt, well, double hurt. One, there wasn't the global policy impetus to develop their resources. But two, as we said, starting 2019, global institutions like the World Bank start to stop all the public finance. And so what you've had is that in Africa, when you had a large string of discoveries in the 2010s, most of the biggest gas discoveries of the decade were in Africa, most of it sitting in the ground and very little of it developed for the domestic market.
Are you thinking about Mozambique or other countries?
Other places, Tanzania,
Yeah.
Basically almost all the gas resources except for Mozambique. And I think if we would have developed those resources, can you imagine today, fast forward to the crisis today, would it be no crisis? No. Would it be a lot less crisis if we had a bit, 10% more LNG in the market that wasn't dependent on the Straits? If we had Africa basically self-sufficient with gas and oil and not dependent on those resources, Africa producing its own fertilizer from its own natural gas, we would be in again, it wouldn't solve the whole crisis, but we would be in a different crisis. Or
part of it is also being able to anticipate demand. And because there are so many different scenarios possible, depending on which technologies is advancing or not. Like, for example, now everybody is talking about nuclear again, potentially, as a medium-term, long-term solution for increased electrification in industrialized nations, especially the one that would host data centers and so on. And so that could cut some of the demand for fossil fuels, potentially. So how do we make sure that we plan for different scenarios, knowing that might be some white elephants in terms of infrastructure project, or maybe some of them, some export projects will not be fully utilized, but they are needed for security of supply, and they are needed for optionality, and also for emerging markets to, for their electricity access.
Right. And that's the second part of your question is part of the problem. So commercial decisions, will continue to be made, and the market usually does a great job at it. The fact that actually today we can have the disruption in Hormuz, and we're not seeing $150 or $200 oil, and lights going out anywhere, actually shows that how much we've improved in general, and how the market can respond to these various disruptions. But um, the global energy security side is missing. So you had this. I mean, if you look for EU, for sure, like they sit next to so many different gas sources that if they just would have given either a long-term contract or public finance, it would have, let's say, third and fourth stages of Azerbaijani gas into Europe. They could have East Med gas. They could have more Algerian gas. If they just would have, there would have been, a concrete commitment or public finance. United States, if you look during the Biden period, the last year he stopped new LNG exports. If you look at the national security strategy, national security doctrine under Biden, everything about fossil fuels is negative. This is at the time when the U.S. is the largest producer of oil and natural gas in the world. So we've had for a long period nobody thinking about, or at least in the West, nobody thinking about global energy security. I mean, of the leading governments. And as I said, World Bank still is not giving loans for fossil fuels. So the source of energy that most people use, the World Bank isn't giving resources. International Energy Agency, I don't accept if in 2021 you should say there's no new investments in fossil fuels, and now you're saying, hey, how do we get more investments in fossil fuels? I don't know what they're going to say in the next round. As well, but you have to be able to anticipate these problems, not to talk about, not just to respond to these problems. So we really don't have many captains steering any ships for this global energy security.
Yeah. I mean, one of the reasons why there was so much dogma and ideology around renewable is also because there was this idea that it would reduce emissions, right? And that we have this problem of global warming that we need to solve also. But we see a country like Germany now that emits the most, CO2 emissions in Europe because they have ideologically, after the great Fukushima disaster, that's potentially one of the mistakes that you have in mind. They close and phase out nuclear energy. But in turn, they have turned to coal and lignite to power their industry and their electricity. They also have made huge investments in LNG infrastructure to import more natural gas after the Ukraine war. So it's much more mixed as a result in terms of their carbon footprint. How do you think we should think about those different priorities? And if we take the example of Europe, they need to remain competitive. Some of them will rearm, which means more industrialization, which means more energy usage. Some of them, want to remain clean as a priority. And then we have energy security. Is it possible to combine all this and manage to have, smart policy making around all those different priorities that sometimes conflict with one another?
Okay, so a lot to unpack there. First thing, before Europe thinks about increasing industrialization, I think they need to stop about how do they stop deindustrialization. I mean, there's no way that the UK, Germany, most other players in Europe can think about developing serious defense industries while they have very expensive and increasingly unreliable electricity. I mean, you just cannot be a manufacturing power, whether it's for military or for civilian uses, when you have expensive electricity. I mean, let's recall how many businesses have moved from Mexico into the United States, right? Because the biggest input into manufacturing is not labor, but it's energy. So cheap energy on the overside of the border brought businesses, from Mexico into the United States, cheaper manufacturing. And how many businesses have crossed the pond as European and British energy prices have gone up and companies have moved to cheaper energy in the United States. You have to have cheap and or affordable and reliable electricity in order to have a manufacturing base, and certainly to have a defense base. Um, in terms of the climate policies, I mean, I think a lot of us have to ask a question. I'm doing this in a current book that I'm writing and researching right now. Why suddenly the world became so negative on natural gas? I mean, for years in our profession, coal switching to natural gas was part of our public policy, right? Where you can convert from coal to natural gas, you're going to lower air pollution, you're going to lower carbon emissions. Suddenly around 2018, 2019, methane becomes the new devil. Without any new science, any explanations.
Russian propaganda?
I would actually blame it on China this time, because I think when they realized they couldn't frack, at the beginning, I think all over the world, when fracking was starting, when the United States was starting to emerge as a major natural gas producer, all over the world, countries were looking at their capacity for fracking. And China, I think, was optimistic when they finally realized that the kind of geology they have there and water shortages, that they're not really going to be able to be a fracker. Suddenly they were facing the United States. It was not just a scientific power, not just a military power, but now taking its crown as a manufacturing power once it has cheap energy. And
just on this, I think also at the time where Europe was, France especially, was trying to find shale gas potentially, there were many protests anti-shale financed by Russia also, because
right.
Russia wanted to keep a stronghold in Europe with Gazprom and its pipelines.
Right, like even like the Parliament of Bulgaria, Parliament of Ukraine blocked fracking from an environmental perspective, right? Like, not countries that are really well known. Sorry to friends in Bulgaria and Ukraine, but not well known for their environmental protection. But suddenly, they banned fracking in their countries. So you see suddenly the whole, all the emphasis of the environmental movements is on preventing use of natural gas, production of natural gas. Natural gas, even if you believe methane was had serious long-term climate impact, natural gas only emits from production and use in the world 4% of global methane emissions. So why would you start with something that's so essential to life in the West, to prosperity, to basic living, where your only real alternative to that is nuclear, which is expensive too expensive for most countries and too long term, or coal, which obviously has other pollution problems and emissions problems. Why would you attack the use of natural gas when you really don't have any alternative for your baseload for electricity? And if you were really so concerned about methane emissions, if it really was this huge danger, as we've heard from so many environmental organizations like Rocky Mountain Institute that was promoting the banning of gas consuming appliances in the United States. If it was so dangerous, why don't we start, for instance, with Chinese rice? Rice is 10% of global methane emissions. If really methane was so dangerous, maybe we should start with how they produce rice in China and most of Asia.
Now, I had heard about the cows. I had never heard about rice.
Rice, just stop rice. So I know this sounds a bit ridiculous, right? Well, how can you expect people to stop producing and consuming rice? And I actually don't expect them. Just like I don't expect Europeans or Americans to stop using natural gas, because that would be, ridiculous too. So this whole idea that we should, we had methane taxes in the United States. You have in the EU, no public finance for natural gas, difficulty for companies to engage in long-term contracts for natural gas. The idea that we should stop using natural gas, it either is Chinese motivated or from this ideology of sort of zero deindustrialization, that we shouldn't use any fossil fuels. It doesn't matter what their climate impact is or pollution or anything, but it's really about an idea that we shouldn't be industrial societies, or it's probably a combination of the two. So, um,
And then maybe, like you mentioned the environmental component of it. The other idea to promote electrification and maybe the anti-gas position is also driven by this idea that countries will become more strategic autonomy, like have a greater strategic autonomy if they reduce their import dependency on fossil fuel, and that if they produce at home their energy, whether it's renewable or nuclear or geothermal or other, that will create for them greater energy security.
So first thing, we should be fuel neutral. In a place where, let's say a place like Norway, where they have really ample hydropower, or Iceland, geothermal. So sure, maybe in these locations, to have a great percentage of your electricity on renewable energy, makes a lot of sense, right? But then when you try to run, in New York City, on today's renewable, that's not when you cut off access to natural gas, even from Pennsylvania and into New York, that isn't a practical solution. So we should be fuel neutral. And of course, to diversify, a combination of renewables and fossil fuels and nuclear, and again, depending the fuel mix, depending on the place, but of course, diversification makes sense. But this idea that renewables are local, I would actually challenge that, because again, the hardware is mostly from China. It's even, we could even open up a whole, even the hardware, it's not like one time from China, but because so many components of the renewable energy system, especially the inverters from solar and wind to the grid, are produced in China and communicating with China and can be controlled by China, right? So they're really not local. And of course, everything like a wind tower, it needs so much, oil as a lubricant. As we said, solar and wind work on a base load, usually of natural gas, coal, or nuclear. Nuclear certainly isn't local. If you need to receive the fuel and to relate, store the spent fuel in a foreign country. But even nuclear, looking like from a national security perspective, recently Taiwan closed down its nuclear energy capacity. They've just added now a carbon tax on their industry. But at the same time, they're asking the United States, if we're in a crisis with China, we want like U.S. convoys for natural gas. I say you can't shut down your nuclear, which relatively, at least it would give you, let's say, a year, until you need it to receive fuel supplies, or maybe longer, depending on their storage. You can't close down your nuclear and then say, but please help us, get natural gas. So I think, even nuclear isn't being, so many countries for like you said in your introduction. Japan is not shut down nuclear because of Fukushima, but Germany shut down nuclear because of Fukushima. Taiwan, to a certain extent, motivated by that. Our policies are not really that rational.
Yeah, I would say it's about timing potentially, because now we see that SoftBank just announced, I think, more than $50 billion to be potentially invested in France for data centers, because they are attracted into the nuclear energy. Like France is still deriving about 70% of its electricity from nuclear.
Yeah.
It's an asset now for some countries to have nuclear energy as a reliable base load. I wanted to come back because you mentioned several times China. And there is a tendency now to oppose the US-led system that some call the petrostates versus a Chinese-led system of electrostates. And I think it's much more complicated than that, because in the US, there are many also, drivers for growing electricity and a big mix of different energies, all the above energies. And same in China. I don't think they have given up at all on fossil fuels, and on the contrary, they combine all of them. So, how do you think about those frameworks? And is there an attractiveness right now to follow the Chinese model globally?
So yeah, I think it's basically very sophisticated, the impact of very sophisticated propaganda that works on, sort of a base load of anti-Americanism that, that exists anyways, actually more in the West than in the non-Western countries. And, China successfully, taps into that. So think about it. If you look, go to the webpage of most environmental movements, climate movements, even International Energy Agency, right? Who is the darling? Who is the green leader? It's China, right? It's like very clear on their China page, on their main summaries, their main reports, right? China, that uses more coal than all other consumers of coal in the world together, the largest producer of coal, has extreme pollution of its water, air, and solar. It produces like half of the world's electric vehicles, and somehow that seems very green, but they're not electric vehicles. They're coal-fired cars, right? Because the electricity,
In China.
yeah, but
Mm.
but even when those cars are exported, most places, I mean, this idea that electric cars somehow have less emissions, there may be less pollution at the source, in the city itself, but most places their electricity, is from a combination of or high penetration of coal, natural gas, and those electric cars are not necessarily less emissions than conventional cars. Certainly in China, they're coal-fired cars, right? So China prefers coal over oil because most of their oil is imported. From an energy security perspective, it makes more sense to use local coal versus imported oil, from an economic perspective as well. So electric vehicles make sense for China, but there's nothing green about it. Again, Chinese electric vehicles are coal-fired cars. But why do most of the environmental organizations sort of accept this idea that that China is the green leader? Some of it is money. China, from the late 2010s, China started, sending regular, a lot of money to many environmental organizations in the West. And second, there's something sort of wider ideological connection, which we could call the red, green, green coalition. Red, which is the leftist, communists, first green, which is Islamists. I'm not saying Muslims, but I'm saying Islamists, political Islam. And the other green, which is the climate movements, that basically many of them share funding sources, share a very, pro-China agenda. And, the idea of, in the end of the day, policies that weaken electricity in the West, weaken the energy security of the West, but at the same time, China forges ahead with, reliable and cheap coal to power its manufacturing base. These are the policies that this wider coalition, supports and cooperates on.
So, what's the advantage for China, like in terms of geoeconomics? Is it to make the rest of the world more dependent on their manufacturing?
I mean, when it makes the world more dependent on their manufacturing too, through the climate funds, they also, receive a lot of money, sort of as a country that was a developing country, all the imports of their renewables, through their renewables, you increase the Western's dependence on Chinese manufacturing, Chinese supply chains. Many of these manufactured goods, whether it's inverters for solar and wind into the grid, or electric vehicles, also contain Chinese surveillance, kill switches. So you have a variety of really sort of control of a major infrastructure in the West. And then also, if the West itself, if it has disruptions of electricity, has expensive electricity, obviously its manufacturing is weakened, its independence is weakened. And as we discussed before, you can't even think of starting an arms industry or on an expensive electricity basis.
Very interesting. Actually, I wanted to ask you more about this topic that you're researching now. So we'll switch to more of your personal trajectory. So, Brenda, you're writing a new book, if I understood correctly.
Right,
And some of that research is based on something you just mentioned, this kind of red green alliance. So it's more like an ideological alliance in a way, where we see some common denominators or understanding common grounds between those groups of Islamo leftist radical groups of mixed with um, climate extremists or catastrophists, the way you want to call them. And so they are cooperating on what? Anti-imperialism, anti-Western values, anti-capitalism. Can you explain a little bit more, like how do they seem to have so opposite belief, and in a way they meet on those grounds, also including anti-Zionism and other topics.
right. So it's actually not this red, green, green alliance. It's not even climate extremists. I would say it's most of the mainstream climate organizations. First thing, they share a lot of these organizations share a lot of funding. There's a lot of Chinese money that goes through pass-throughs in the West, or cooperates with very leftist foundations in the West, that goes into the climate organizations and climate so-called journalism. Like half the time when you see a climate desk or climate department in some media outlet, it's funded by an outside foundation, and that means that these people they're not people that write, these so-called reporters. They're not directed by journalist ethics, but their salary comes from foundations that are committed to a certain climate agenda. So we haven't been really getting objective journalism on climate from almost the majority of our media sources, which outsource it to climate to foundations.
And some NGOs are directly writing reports also that they send to journalists. So they are feeding them also with some data research that are biased, and not scientifically always backed up.
Yeah, and I would say that that's the majority of when you see any major media source discussing some discovery, some new data in the climate world about climate. It's coming from NGOs, organizations they're committed to propagating this information. Like, they're not committed to the pure science, right? And even the main organization that correlates most of the data and analysis on climate is United Nations. Well, we know quite well the United Nations is not, it's not a laboratory, it's not a university, it's a very political organization. We know so many topics that, the UN's positions are ridiculously politicized. Yet for some reason we believe when it comes to climate that they actually just are suddenly pure scientists. I was looking. There's a scientist in the United States, John Christie. Has worked for University of Alabama, NASA. He just published a really, really serious article. This guy's like very thorough, bombastic. It was really taking a new look at, like, from thermometer to thermometer temperature readings in the United States, and he saw that there's basically no linear temperature rise in the United States over the last, I believe, the last century. No, I didn't see any article in New York Times, Washington Post, NPR discussing this research, right? But some NGO, that's could be partially China funded, committed to climate change, right? They'll suddenly come up with a new report, and it's all over the media, as if it's a fact, right? So I keep tracking, when will one mainstream, if someone's listening, one mainstream media source discuss Christie's new article, which was really revolutionary, or even how, when you see with the UN changing its positions on which scenarios it views as a realistic, the coverage is it's quite ridiculous. Oh, this was always an extreme scenario, or well, that's because we changed our emissions. Neither are true, right? But this is what mainstream media like Washington Post, New York Times, Financial Times how they'll report about the UN decision, instead of saying, hey, there's some good news. The situation is not as dire as we thought. They have to still keep the narrative going.
Mm. It makes me think I've just watched the movie that I recommend, The Wizard of the Kremlin. And it centers on the rise of Vladimir Putin and
Uh-huh.
his communication strategy and his spin doctor. But there are very good lines in the movie about how Russia's goal has been to create confusion, polarization in the Western world. And there are very good scenes where, this chief propagandist is explaining how to spread chaos in our Western democracy, right? Like, he gives the analogy of a wire where you turn it left, right, and then it breaks, right? And basically, it's not even believing in one cause anymore. Like, in so many different causes and narratives, and I thought it was very interesting. And I guess China is also using kind of the same strategies these days of creating distrust, basically, and what is the truth? If we read a news article, like, what can we believe on climate change?
Right.
And and so I think the use of social media also for those kind of countries that are trying
Sure.
to manipulating young mind is also important to highlight.
I agree with you. It's a very similar playbook to what happened with COVID. So if you think about how we gave up our civil liberties, we agreed, to stay in homes. We agreed that our children wouldn't go to school, even though, doctors were saying that the COVID doesn't pose a danger to children. It's less of a danger than the regular, seasonal influenza. And we still send kids to schools during it's flu season. We basically shut down the global economy because there was, and even things, almost every one of us, and if you've had like basic, I don't know, fifth grade biology class, that your bandana on your face is not going to stop a virus, right? Why did we all go along with this? Because fear. You think that there's something out there that you don't understand, right? So it's very similar with the climate. I think that they've been very some people who actually believe, right? But I think some interested parties have been very good at creating this fear factor that, for instance, co-option of extreme weather, hurricanes, sea level rise, right? Today, if you look even at the IPCC, right, even the UN's version of climate, it says that today there's no impact of extreme weather except for the amount of days in a row that there's heat waves. There's no impact on extreme weather. There could be in the future, but there isn't today.
Impact on the economy or impact on what?
On the amount or the frequency of
Right.
extreme weather events, right? So you don't have more intense hurricanes, more
Okay.
frequent hurricanes. You don't have more floods, less floods, right? You have much less wildfires. Like if you look from the beginning of the 20th century to today, we're down to about a quarter of the amount of acreage in the world that's burnt by wildfires, right? Yet every time when you have a wildfire in the Palisades in California, it's very convenient for politicians to blame climate change. When you have an arsonist, you saw a year and a half ago in California, a Mr. Climate Change. Right? You see a guy, an arsonist, right? But that's climate change. Every flood, instead of saying, yeah, we did very poor planning and built a town or a camp in a floodplain, but it's just easier to say, oh, this was climate change than the politicians don't have to pay for their mistakes. So and extreme weather is scary, right? It's out of control, big things of water, floods, all these kind of things. So if you look at our press, every extreme weather event, every wildfire, it's climate change. When again, like even the more politicized science that's promoting the extreme climate agenda, like the United Nations, they don't even claim that extreme weather has changed because of climate change today.
I mean, the other thing going on is that when you have those apocalypse scenario, you don't play the technological advances that could
Yeah,
potentially mitigate all those
sure,
global warming impacts.
right.
And so it's like driving a lot of pessimism rather than looking at potential solutions.
Right. And if you took, like, for instance, why the solution has been that renewable energy is if you really were concerned with a fast way to reduce emissions, putting all that manufacturing into solar, wind, and high voltage cables, that probably was not the fastest way to lower emissions. But again, it's an ideological decision. There was an interest of various organizations, people, that we don't have the benefits of fossil fuels, that we have this more expensive and less reliable electricity. And you mentioned the word like clean energy. So the idea that low carbon energy is clean and fossil fuels the assumption is that fossil fuels is dirty. I think people who think that should travel more, because I've traveled in many places that don't have regular access to fossil fuels, especially in East Africa, which is one part of the world that I really I love the people, the geography. I've spent a lot of time in my life there. And when you see people that don't have access to electricity, to fossil fuels and electricity produced from fossil fuels, the first thing notice is the extreme smoke, how people have a very short life expectancy. Many of them died in their 40s. How many people lose their sight? How many women and children have high levels of respiratory diseases? Because fossil fuels replace the real dirty energy, which is smoke, which is burning dung, biomass, wood.
Including for cooking.
Yeah, people have to have energy. It's not like this idea. If you look at the Green New Deal in Europe or the United States, it's like as if prior to fossil fuels, everything, animals and people lived in harmony and everything was wonderful. Then fossil fuels came and made pollution. Well, it's exactly the opposite. When you have access to fossil fuels, especially to natural gas, you actually can take the smoke out of the hut or the home, and you have a lot less smoke, and what you have, is not directly, indoor pollution. It's outdoor pollution. And again, I think it's quite cruel, this denial of fossil fuels to people that, again, they're gonna use energy, and it's just going to be a lot dirtier energy than fossil fuels.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Brenda. We've covered a lot, and I look forward to reading your new book.
Thank you.
And I hope we'll have you back on the Energy Vista podcast once the book is out. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
This episode was recorded on June 3rd, 2026. This is Leslie Palti-Guzman saying good day and good luck. If you like what you hear, want to support Energy Vista, discuss sponsorship, or send feedback, contact me.